delighted to welcome everyone to this morning's program on Uganda. I'm Howard Wall, Director of the Africa Program here at the Wilson Center. For those of you who are familiar with the Wilson Center, it was established by an act of Congress in 1968 as the nation's official living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, as both a distinguished scholar, the first American president to hold a doctorate, and a national leader. Wilson felt strongly that the scholar and the policy maker engaged in a common enterprise. Aiming to bridge the gap between the world of ideas and the world of policy, the Wilson Center is a nonpartisan institution for advanced study and uses forms of open, serious, and informal dialogue. Today's meeting, I'm very pleased to have co-sponsored with the Center for Strategic International Studies. And in a few moments, you'll be hearing from the director of the Africa program at the Center, Steve Morrison, who is up here on the platform with us. I also want to acknowledge a few very distinguished guests who are with us today. The Minister of Internal Affairs of Uganda, Minister Uganda. I hope I've not butchered that too terribly. I'm sorry. Delighted to have you with us, Mr. Minister. And the Ambassador of Uganda, Edith Sampala, welcome to the Wilson Center on yet another occasion. We also have two, or at least maybe perhaps three, former American ambassadors to Uganda with us this morning. One of them I'll introduce in a moment, who's on the program, Johnnie Carson, but also Ambassador Nancy Powell is with us in the audience. And I saw Mike Southwick's name on the list of respondents. I didn't know that Uganda was a former posting of Bob Hodek, and of course former Assistant Secretary Hank Cohen. Very pleased to have all of you here with us this morning. And Ambassador Princeton Lyman, who has just arrived. There's some to go through. I think also perhaps Ambassador Masenga is with us this morning, Ambassador of Rwanda. Is expected. I also want to extend a welcome to people who are watching this event in the overflow room. There may well be some opportunity, some space available following the formal presentations today, and would invite you to come into the auditorium to participate in the Q&A session that will be following the presentations. This event is being telecast, webcast, live, and I want to welcome those who are watching online as well. Under President Museveni's leadership, Uganda emerged from its nightmare of decades of brutality and poor governance. The Uganda of today is a very different Uganda than the Uganda of Obote and Idi Amin, thanks to the visionary and pragmatic quality of its national leadership. Today, Uganda, a strong and important African partner of the United States, continues to receive very high marks for the open and vociferous quality of its political debate, for its free market economic reforms, and for the progressive economic vision that President Museveni has championed, which he discussed actually during an appearance right here at the Wilson Center some time ago, and for tackling, more effectively than any other African country, the AIDS pandemic. Again, a tribute to the strength and quality of its leadership. Yet, in the past few years, there has emerged growing concern, both inside and outside of Uganda, about emerging trends that could imperil or undermine the important progress Uganda has made over the past 2 decades. The continuing war in northern Uganda, accusations of high-level corruption, uncertainty about Uganda's willingness to institutionalize multi-party electoral democracy, the prospect of constitutional revision to enable President Museveni to seek a 3rd term. All of these issues have generated concern both among Ugandans and among Uganda's strongest supporters within the international community about the country's long-term political and economic prospects. And so today's program, I believe, is particularly timely, and I'm delighted with the quality of the panel that we will have making presentations in just a few moments. Before introducing the members of the panel to you, I'd like to introduce the co-sponsor of this event, Steve Morrison of CSIS.
Thank you, Howard. Good morning. We're thrilled to be able to co-sponsor this and grateful to the Woodrow Wilson Center for extending the invitation. Just a couple of very brief comments. One, I think what we're doing today with the two fine presentations from Joel and Johnnie is actually very significant and momentous, and it marks the opening of a new debate around democratization in U.S. foreign policy towards democratization in Africa, at a time when the President has made clear that this is a central dominant theme for U.S. foreign policy globally, and at a time when it's really not particularly clear yet how that dominant theme in U.S. foreign policy will play itself out in Africa, and specifically with reference to Uganda, at a very special moment in Uganda's history, which we'll hear much more about. Obviously, this debate has been long in coming. We have the special expertise that Joel and Johnnie bring to the table, along with the depth of experience and interest within this audience itself. Uganda, I think it's fair to say, will become a very important test case as to the seriousness of U.S. foreign policy democratization in Africa, driven by the calendar of events and the whole succession question that looms before us on Uganda, driven by the profound and momentous and complex changes underway in Sudan, which now begs the question of whether the crisis in northern Uganda and the massive humanitarian toll it is exacted can be brought to an end. We will also, I hope today, move to the so what question of what does this mean potentially for U.S. foreign policy, and I hope we'll hear from our speakers and from the audience itself. So let me just close by thanking Howard for taking the initiative to put this together, and to thank Joel and Johnnie for investing so much in thinking about this and putting it together. Thank you very much.
Let me introduce the panelists now. Joel Barkan is a professor of political science at the University of Iowa and a distinguished specialist in the politics of East Africa, where he served as the first regional democracy and governance advisor for USAID. Since that experience, he straddled the worlds of academia and the policy community by consulting on a variety of issues pertaining to democratization and governance across Anglophone Africa for governments and for international organizations. He's an old friend of the Wilson Center, having served as a visiting fellow here from 2001-2002. He's also been a visiting fellow at the United States Institute of Peace and at the National Endowment for Democracy, to which he will return this fall as a Reagan-Fussell Fellow. Joel has written extensively on African politics. His most recent article is Kenya After Moi, which appeared in the January-February issue of Foreign Affairs. Joel has lived in Uganda in the late 60s. He has made 8 visits to Uganda since 1988, most recently in March of this year. Johnnie Carson joined the National Defense University as Senior Vice President in August of 2003 upon his return from the Republic of Kenya, where he served as American Ambassador. During his tour as U.S. Ambassador to Kenya, Johnnie was responsible for rebuilding and restoring full diplomatic services at the embassy in Nairobi following its destruction by terrorists in 1998. Before serving in Kenya, he served as American Ambassador to the Republic of Uganda, and later served as Ambassador to Zimbabwe. On the Washington side, he was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for African Affairs at the Department of State, and he's held a number of other assignments as well, both in the field and in Washington. Johnnie also happened to have been my first Chief of Staff when I chaired the Africa Subcommittee back in the 80s. Subsequently, our roles were reversed. When I was Special Envoy, I then reported to Johnnie as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary. So I'm delighted to have both of them participate as our principal presenters today. And I now give the floor to Joel Barkan. Oh, you are. To Johnnie Carson.
First of all, Howard and Steve, thank you both personally for the invitation to take part in this discussion today, and to the institutions that you represent, the Woodrow Wilson Center, as well as CSIS and the Africa program. I too want to extend a very warm welcome to the Minister of Internal Affairs, Dr. Rugunda, a person I have worked with and known well for many, many years. And we're pleased that he is able to join us here this morning. I also welcome all of the members of the diplomatic community here in Washington, especially Mrs. Edith Sampala, the Ugandan ambassador, and I welcome my many Foreign Service colleagues across the room, including those who have had the pleasure, like myself, to serve in Uganda either as an ambassador or as a very young officer like Hank Cohen. But it is a pleasure to talk about Uganda. In talking about the serious economic and political challenges that confront Uganda today, it might be useful to begin with some history and perspective, some rather old history and some rather more recent perspective. In 1908, the famous British statesman and Prime Minister Winston Churchill published a very small and compact book about his 1907 travels through East Africa and the Sudan. In that book, which he entitled My African Journal, Churchill, who had traveled overland from Mombasa, was effusive about what he saw. Churchill said, and I quote, "Uganda is a wonderful new world. The scenery is different, the vegetation is different, the climate is different, and most of all, the people are different from anywhere to be seen in the whole range of Africa." End quote. Churchill went on to describe Ugandans as majestic and elegant, and Uganda as the pearl of Africa, a name that the government still uses in its many tourist brochures. But Churchill was a man of enormous insight and remarked too that there were also sinister aspects to Uganda that were not always easy to see. Although Uganda remains one of the most beautiful countries in Africa with some of the continent's most graceful, well-educated, and kind-hearted people, Uganda's post-independence period has been marked by extended periods of turbulence, brutality, and authoritarian rule by several very sinister leaders. From 1971 to 1985, Uganda was one of Africa's most notorious killing fields. In 1971, Uganda's then army chief, the late Idi Amin, seized power from the country's first elected leader, Milton Obote. During his 8 years in office, Amin unleashed a reign of terror. He started by expelling some 70,000 Asians from Uganda and confiscating all their land and their property. As his tyranny gained steam, he turned on his fellow Ugandans, his fellow Africans. Under his orders and occasionally under his personal supervision, Amin's troops killed over 800,000 Ugandans, including some of the country's most prominent political, educational, and intellectual leaders. Among them were the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Vice Chancellor of Makerere University, the then Foreign Minister, and dozens of other prominent political and business leaders. A Tanzanian-led invasion of Uganda in 1978 resulted in the overthrow of Amin's bloody regime, but it did not usher in a new era of peace and stability. Backed by Tanzania's president, the late Julius Nyerere, Milton Obote was returned to power. However, instead of instituting much-needed economic and political reforms, Obote unleashed a new period of retribution and bloodletting against his previous political adversaries and the remnants of Amin's old army. In 3 short years, Obote was able to create nearly as much havoc as Amin over his 8 years. Obote's army and political thugs, in what might be a precursor to the Rwandan genocide of 1994, butchered and massacred nearly 600,000 people, leaving piles of skulls and decomposing bodies in part of the country called the Luwero Triangle. In 1986, under the remarkable and politically astute leadership of President Museveni, Uganda emerged from its 15-year nightmare of unprecedented violence and mayhem. And certainly in the last decade, Uganda has become one of Africa's real success stories. Popular, charismatic, and a genuine early reformer, President Museveni engineered and guided Uganda's early transformation by essentially accomplishing 5 key strategic goals. First, he stopped much of the bloodletting and violence that had racked most of Uganda. Although it took several years, Museveni consolidated his authority over several rival political groups, brought the ethnic killings and violence to an end, and with the help of the United States and Germany and the World Bank, instituted one of the very first successful military demobilization programs in Africa. His efforts brought peace and stability to the south, to the central and western parts of the country, but not, unfortunately, to the north. Second, Museveni won the early praise and financial backing of the Bretton Woods institutions. Demonstrating remarkable political courage, he reversed Idi Amin's 1971 Asian expulsion order and agreed to return all of the shops, houses, hotels, and large agricultural estates to their previous Asian owners. A program that demonstrated that Museveni was committed to property rights, but also one that was strongly advocated and supported by the World Bank. The new Ugandan leader also adopted a major IMF economic reform program, which he skillfully modified and embraced as his own, at a time when both the bank and the fund were beginning to face stern criticism in many parts of Africa. Third, President Museveni improved the country's tarnished human rights record. In the years before Museveni took over, Uganda's jails were full of political prisoners. Museveni turned this around, steadily releasing those who had been incarcerated by the previous regimes and releasing those who had been opposed to his early initial takeover power. Certainly by the time I completed my tour of duty as U.S. Ambassador in Uganda, there were no political prisoners in Uganda, and the American embassy officers, as well as others from the diplomatic community, were free to visit any of the country's prisons. Fourth, President Museveni moved the country towards greater freedom, democratic freedom, and moved it towards the first steps of instituting new democratic constitution. After assuming power, Museveni empowered a constitutional commission to travel throughout Uganda to collect the ideas of citizens and communities on what type of democratic government they wanted. Eventually, a new constitution was drafted, secret ballot elections under international observation were held, and a freely elected and broadly representative government was installed. Although the ultimate form of the government was President Museveni's movement system, it was a serious first step in the direction of democracy. And finally, President Museveni did what no other African president or leader had done before. He recognized the devastating impact that HIV/AIDS was having on his country and was the first major African leader to speak publicly about the dangers of the HIV/AIDS virus to the continent. He mobilized his entire government to combat this threat, and he established Africa's first nationwide prevention efforts. To the acclaim of the international public health community, Uganda became something of a laboratory for a variety of early HIV/AIDS prevention campaigns. Museveni today remains a champion in the global fight against HIV/AIDS, as well as one of the most influential and intelligent leaders on the continent. There is no doubt that Museveni's initial reforms, many of which I witnessed on the ground, set the stage for Uganda's economic revitalization, its renewed political stability, and its early efforts to reestablish strong democratic institutions. But today, in June 2005, much of what he has accomplished is in serious risk of stalling and faltering, and possibly opening the door to another dark and negative period in Uganda's turbulent history. Uganda's march toward full democracy is on the threshold of becoming unglued as President Museveni and those around him seek to alter the country's constitution to allow him to run for a third or perhaps even a fourth or fifth presidential term. Under a new constitution put in place in 1996, President Museveni was limited, along with all future Ugandan leaders, to 2 terms in office. However, over the last 2 years, President Museveni has shown an increasing desire not to move on when his current term ends in 2006. A strong critic of Uganda's former political leaders and political parties, President Museveni has also been a frequent critic of all political parties and a reluctant supporter of a full return to multi-party politics in his own country. Although President Museveni remains popular in many parts of the country, his desire to remain in power has been opposed by all of Uganda's major opposition parties and some key members in his own movement system. A recent public opinion poll in one of Uganda's newspapers asserted that over 60% of Ugandans surveyed opposed Museveni's bid to alter the country's constitutional term limitations. As the public debate has heated up over Museveni's efforts to stay in power, the opposition has accused the president of using the police to intimidate their leaders and to suppress their public demonstrations. Museveni's attempted power grab has also caused a deep rift inside his own political organization. When several of his key cabinet colleagues voiced public opposition to the constitutional amendment extending presidential terms, President Museveni abruptly threw them out of the government. Among those dismissed were 2 of his oldest and closest political allies, Badandi Sali and Aria Kategaya. Kategaya's departure caused the greatest shock, for before his dismissal, Kategaya, who grew up with President Museveni in Mbarara province, and who later roomed with him as a college student at the University College in Dar es Salaam, was considered the President's most trusted advisor and had served as First Deputy Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, and Minister of the Interior over a long and distinguished life of service on behalf of Uganda and in support of President Museveni. Many observers see President Museveni's efforts to amend the Constitution as a rerun of a common problem that frequently afflicts many African leaders: an unwillingness to follow constitutional norms and to give up political power. Some argue that Museveni's unwillingness to move aside may also be motivated by a desire to protect those around him from later charges of malfeasance and corruption. Last year, a UN report on the violence and illegal economic activities in the eastern Congo alleged that 2 of Museveni's close relatives were involved in smuggling gold and diamonds from the Congo into Uganda. If President Museveni succeeds in altering his country's constitution and remaining in office, it could spark opposition, political unrest, a slowdown in the economy, and a loss of confidence on the part of some donors. It also lead to criticism that Uganda's movement style of democracy will only work if President Museveni is in charge. President Museveni's continuation in power will also retard the resolution of his other major internal issue: the failure to stomp out the long-running insurgency by the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda. The LRA, an ethnically based guerrilla group, has terrorized northern Ugandans for nearly 2 decades. While the LRA is clearly not a political organization, it continues to survive and to draw local support, albeit small core elements, because of the long-standing political and economic grievances among some of the members of the Langi and Choli communities toward President Museveni and the NRM government. The economic growth and development that has occurred in the south, central, and western parts of Uganda have never made it to the north. In recent years, Museveni has blamed the Sudanese government for fueling the LRA's senseless violence. This is largely a canard. While there is absolutely no doubt that the Sudanese have probably put money into the LRA's hands and coffers, the LRA was a dangerous force long before it received any Sudanese assistance and long before the elusive Joseph Kony became the group's current leaders. The problem of the LRA in the north is not a military problem and cannot be resolved through military means. And it is about time that the international community take a serious look at the root causes of the political strife and the very ugly brutality being perpetrated on the people by the LRA in northern Uganda, and begin to help Uganda fashion durable mechanisms and solutions to resolve the problem. Many Northerners dislike President Museveni and the movement and believe he has intentionally ignored the serious social and economic conditions that afflict their communities. President Museveni's government must improve the operational effectiveness of its northern military units and end the high-level military corruption that encourages some military personnel to allow the northern conflict to drag on to their economic benefit. Until the Ugandan government is able to build better relations between North and South and to bring development projects and outside investment into the northern communities in the same manner as it has done in the South, the LRA will continue to find the handful of willing recruits to help carry out the rape, the mutilations, the pillage, and the burning of villages that has characterized their politics and their violence. How President Museveni deals with these issues of presidential term limitations, the expansion of multi-party politics, and the LRA violence in the North will depend on what type of legacy he wants to leave behind for himself and for Uganda. One in which economic growth, democratic progress, and political stability prevail, or a nation that is faced with a new round of destabilizing political challenges and continued civil conflict in the North. Although many will suggest that these are national decisions, in reality, the decision is his. But the outcome will surely affect all Ugandans and perhaps others as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll remain seated in order to better follow what I want to say. I do not have polio. I can't stand up. It's a great honor to be back here at the Wilson Center for this program, and I want to thank Howard and Steve. I also want to welcome the minister here, with whom I just learned yesterday I'll be appearing with later this afternoon on the Voice of America to discuss patterns of democratization in Eastern Africa. And I'm also quite overwhelmed by the turnout, but I think Howard and I and Steve and Johnnie are certainly happy to see so many of you have turned out. Uganda, as Ambassador Carson has suggested, is at risk of becoming another African tragedy. Not another failed state mired in civil war, but a former failed state that successfully rebuilt its polity and its economy under a brilliant leader who now risks squandering his own legacy to his nation. As Johnnie has noted in his remarks, the movement government came to power in January 1986 and accomplished much during its first 10 years in power. First and foremost, it brought peace and security throughout most, if not all, of the country by reconstituting a broken state. Put simply, it provided effective government. Second, it reshaped an economy that had withered into a subsistence economy, and with massive support from the international donor community, launched that economy on an extended period of real economic growth and poverty alleviation. Third, it began, but has not finished, the process of establishing legitimate and democratic institutions via which all Ugandans, major political groups, would have a stake in the new system and would resolve their differences under democratic rules. Substantial political liberalization, as Johnnie mentioned, not only the reduction of human rights abuses, but one of the freest presses in Africa, the reemergence of civil society, political liberalization, but as I'll suggest, not democratization. The 1995 Constitution, which was already mentioned, and in 1996, what was at that time probably the freest and fairest election on the African continent. Unfortunately, the record of the first 10 years has not been matched by the record of the second decade, and especially since the last presidential election held in 2001. Although the government of Uganda has carefully maintained a prudent set of macroeconomic policies that have elicited continued aid flows, which have in turn propped up the economy so that the annual rate of growth is still about 5%, there are real political and structural risks that threaten to undermine this record. Indeed, the rate of economic growth has tapered off since the late 1990s, while the proportion of people living in poverty has risen since 2000. In 1988 to 1995, the rate of growth was 7.3%. From 96 to 2000, it dropped slightly to 6.3. From 2001 to 2004, the last year for which we have figures, it's down a little bit further to 5.8. The percentage of people living in poverty was reduced from roughly 50% to 35% in 2000, but by 2003 had risen to 38% and is probably up a couple of notches today. 60% of the people in the north live in poverty. 50% in the people of the eastern part of Uganda live in poverty. 50% of all agricultural producers, who constitute 3/4 of Uganda's population, live in poverty, i.e. on a purchasing power of under $1 a day. More seriously, during the last 5 years, the process of establishing a fledgling democracy has slowed to the point that this is on the verge of being reversed. After an extended period of political liberalization that I just described, but also including the strengthening of Parliament, a very interesting story that we could spend some time on, but obviously do not have the time, the judiciary, serious watchdog agencies such as the IGG, the Government Inspector General, and especially, as I noted, a free media. Uganda has now slipped back into a period of what academics describe as a neo-patrimonial or big-time regime. A regime that resembles the Moi regime in Kenya at the beginning of the 1990s. The government of Yoweri Museveni is a combination of a regime based increasingly on corruption and force that now seeks to perpetuate itself through the manipulation and orchestration of the transition from single-party to multi-party rule. We have seen it all before, and the scenario is not good. Nor is it in the interest of the United States, nor Uganda's other development partners, who now provide 52% of the country's annual recurrent budget, because they are directly and indirectly financing a potential downward spiral. There are three big and interrelated issues that dominate Ugandan politics today, and Ambassador Carson touched briefly on the first two. They are usually discussed separately, but since each impacts and reinforces upon the other, it is essential to discuss them as a group, and that is the main contribution I hope to make in the next few minutes. They are as follows. The transition to multi-party politics and the question of whether President Museveni will amend the Constitution and stand for a third elected 5-year term. What would be his 21st through 25th year in Africa. Not the pattern of a new leader of Africa, as he once was described, rather the pattern of an old leader that we saw in the 1980s. Secondly, the war in the north, now also an extended conflict in its 19th year. Thirdly, the persistence and spread of grand corruption, including by members of the First Family and their associates, to the point that it constitutes a drag on economic growth and threatens the legitimacy of the regime. The transition to multi-party politics and the issue of the third term. The transition to multi-party politics has long been resisted by President Museveni, as Ambassador Carson noted. And indeed, the movement system was viewed by Museveni and his colleagues in the National Resistance Movement as an alternative to multi-party politics that was ideally suited to Uganda's history and needs. It was originally conceived as a competitive political system within a no-party framework, but it has morphed into a classic example of the old one-party African state dominated by a single leader. Uganda today is a regime based around one man and not democratic institutions. The movement is Museveni, and Museveni is the movement. However, the demand for multi-party politics has been constant since the return of elected civilian government in 1996. Moreover, the 1995 Constitution explicitly addressed the issue by stating that 1 year before the end of the first elected parliament and first elected presidential terms, that is to say in 2001, there would be a referendum to determine whether Uganda would retain the movement system or switch to multi-party politics. Therefore, a referendum on this question was held in 2000, and the movement system was retained, though often as a result of strong-arm tactics of questionable nature at the time. President Museveni then ran for his second and presumably final elected presidential term in 2001. He was elected with over 70% of the vote, but again, after strong-arm tactics were used to defeat his former comrade in arms and a member of the movement, Kizza Besigye. There was not a level playing field in the elections of 2001. Those elections were very different from the elections of 1996. The referendum of 2000 and the election of 2001 set the stage for the present transition and potential crisis. By March 2003, when the NRM held its national conference and meeting of its National Executive Committee, it was clear that domestic pressures, both within and outside the movement, combined with international realities, require that Uganda open up political space by making the transition to multi-party politics. After all, Uganda in 2003 was not 1993. By 2003, all but 4 of Africa's 47 countries had held multi-party elections. The stage was just therefore set for another referendum as required by Articles 69, 70, and 71 of Uganda's Constitution, or by a 2/3 vote of all members of Parliament and a 2/3 vote by all members of at least half of Uganda's 56 district councils to change the political system from the movement system to one that would permit multi-party politics. It was at this point that President Museveni raised the highly controversial prospect of also amending the Constitution to permit him to run for a 3rd term, what Ugandans call Ikasanja. By repealing Section 105(2) of the Constitution, which limited each incumbent to 2 elected terms. This has been a highly controversial move. President Museveni and others have frequently defended the potential of the amending of the constitutions on the grounds that Uganda is a sovereign state and that outside observers should not dictate to Uganda whether or not they amend their constitution. Part of the point is valid, but it is not the donors and people of the North who are simply calling for an adherence to the two-term limit. A number of other African countries have amended their constitutions to insert a 2-term limit. South Africa for one, Tanzania, Kenya, Namibia, Zambia. This is by no means a foreign phenomenon. And in every case, with the exception of Namibia so far, although in some cases there have been attempts to perhaps raise the issue of repealing term limits, I forgot to add Malawi, term limits has been adhered to. Term limits, presidential term limits, in other words, has become the African norm. And we see this nowhere better than in the neighboring country of Tanzania, arguably one of the most stable countries in Africa and certainly the most stable country in the East African region, where current President Benjamin Mkapa announced, in fact, that his ruling party would nominate their candidate for the forthcoming elections 5 months before the elections would be held. In other words, the idea of amending the Constitution and staying on was never in anyone's mind. The combination of multi-party politics and the repeal of Section 105, Clause 2, has split the movement, as Ambassador Carson has mentioned, with several of President Museveni's closest colleagues leaving the movement or being forced out because of their unhappiness with the intention of the president to remain in office after 19 years in power. The group includes more than simply Arya Katagaya and Badande Sali, two of the most prominent members. It also includes Mugisha Muntu, former head of the army, Augustine Ruzindana, former prominent member of parliament, also from the Yembarara region, and others, including the former political commissar of the NRM, the late James Bakabulu, who had his doubts about the third-term project. These were founding members of the movement, and their conception of the movement was as I described it a couple of minutes ago, i.e., a no-party state, a competitive political system where people would indeed be elected on merit, there would be a circulation of political elites, and most important, in the minds of Katagaya and Sali, with whom I've met on my recent visits, their concern was that they would consolidate the accomplishments of the movement by turning over power to the next generation of leaders. And it's by turning over to a younger group that their legacy would be consolidated and perpetuated. They now view Ikasanja as nothing more than a return to dictatorship and trouble. And sadly, they are probably correct on both counts. In September 2003, the government submitted its proposals for constitutional amendments to the Constitutional Review Commission, which reviewed the Constitution and issued its own report in March 2004. Interestingly, the Commission made no recommendation on the repeal of the term limits clause of the Constitution. Not surprisingly, it recommended that the Constitution be amended to facilitate a change to multi-party politics. The government responded with its own official white paper in September of last year. Since then, the proposals for multi-party politics, Ikasanja, and a large number of other proposals, I believe there are 98 in all, including a limited form of federalism to accommodate the aspirations of some Baganda, have been hotly debated in Uganda's parliament and the press. The bottom line is that President Museveni has carried the day. The issue of Uganda adopting a multi-party system has never been in doubt. Both supporters and opponents of the president want this. Indeed, the national resistance movement has already registered itself under the Uganda's Political Parties and Organizations Act, basically as a political party. In terms of the formal name, the National Resistance Movement Organization. The word party is evidently a little bit too hard to accept, but it has registered itself under the PPOA. It is the issue of repealing Article 105 that has been the focus of most of the controversy. Until November of last year, members of the National Assembly opposed to the lifting of term limits thought they had more than enough votes to block the change because they only needed 1/3 of the votes to do so. To pass the change would have required 197 of the 302 votes. The repeal of term limits can be accomplished by Parliament via two-thirds vote. The change from the movement system to a multi-party system requires a referendum or this dual vote that I described before, two-thirds of the vote of Parliament and then of the district councils. But the opposition felt that they had sufficient votes to block the repeal of term limits. However, after November, it became clear that President Museveni could marshal the votes through a combination of carrots and sticks. To begin with, 5 million shillings, roughly $3,000, was paid to a large number of members of Parliament, roughly over half of them, back in November. There was also the threat to members of Parliament of running opponents against them at the time of the next parliamentary elections, which must be held by June of 2006, but which may be moved up to March of next year. Running opponents against incumbents, both for the nomination of the NRMO, if they chose to stick with the movement, and obviously running opponents against them if they jumped to one of the new opposition parties or the old ones. There's also the increasing use of strong-arm tactics to deny permits, for example, to politicians to hold meetings, to break up meetings that had been scheduled, including the use of thugs, as I not directly observed, but talked with a victim of in March of last year, in a previous visit to Uganda, and to otherwise cow MPs who have joined to create an opposition party, the Forum for Democratic Change, or FDC. There has also been the expansion of ad hoc militia groups that might be used as militias were used in Kenya in the early 90s during the run-up to an election campaign. And especially, and most disturbing, the transformation of the Presidential Protection Unit, a presidential guard previously involving roughly 200 individuals, similar to our own Secret Service, transformation of the PPU to the Presidential Guard Brigade, an armed force of now 10,000 individuals, equipped with battle cars, possibly tanks. I don't have all the details, I'm not privy to that, but substantial armaments. In short, a Praetorian Guard whose purpose is not to defend Uganda's borders, but to do what Praetorian Guards normally do, protect the incumbent. President Museveni is absolutely determined to play hardball to win approval for the repeal of term limits and the elections that will follow. Put simply, he regards himself and his presidency as indispensable to the future of Uganda. And if you have any doubts about this, please read verbatim comments about recent speeches in Ugandan press, including by the New Vision, the partly government-owned newspaper. Elections must be held by March 12, 2006. Presidential elections must be held by March 2006, and parliamentary elections will probably be moved up to that date to save costs. This is a little more than 9.5 months from now. But first, a referendum is scheduled for July 21st to change the political system from the movement system to a multi-party system. In addition to the constitutional changes, the repeal of Article 105, the referendum scheduled for July, there is a substantial amount of subsidiary legislation that must be passed in order to facilitate the elections scheduled only 9.5 months from now. In respect to the Electoral Commission, preparatory work by the Commission, a revision of the Political Parties and Organization Act, registration of voters, etc., etc. And there's a real question of whether all this work can be accomplished by March of next year, and if it can't be accomplished, even if the government carries through on goodwill and at all deliberate speed, what will happen then? Whether there will be an a constitutional crisis, whether the term will be extended, and the like. I want to turn now to the War of the North, although Howard has I think, already got his notes out. Let me simply say, be brief here, the war is in the 19th year. It is not simply a conflict between the LRA and the Uganda People's Defense Force. It is indeed a military conflict, but it is also a conflict between the North, peoples of one region of the North, the Acholis people, and the current regime, a war between North and South. It is an intra-Acholi war because the victims are largely, of the LRA are largely Acholi, and the LRA is, of course, mainly Acholi. And to a lesser extent, there is the Sudanese dimension, although that seems to be receding into the background. The government and the LRA became very close to negotiating the end to the conflict at the end of last year, facilitated by the heroic efforts of Betty Bigombe and the Minister of Internal Affairs, who is with us today. But fighting resumed when the LRA asked for more time to consider the terms of the agreement, although a revised proposal was communicated to Kony and his number 2, Vincent Ade, in February of this year. Betty Bigombe is in periodic phone contact with Kony and Ade, but the situation has stalled since mid-March. Indeed, Betty Bigombe has had no contact with Kony and Ade, to my knowledge, for the last 2 or 3 weeks since her return from a visit to the International Criminal Court, another dimension which we might get to in the question period, which factors into the equation here. Moreover, 5 of the 7 members of the LRA negotiating team that negotiated with Bigombe and Minister Rugunda in December are, to my understanding, now dead, and the most prominent member, Samuel Kolo, has come out of the bush. In other words, this channel has broken down. Meanwhile, the LRA fight on. Indeed, that is one of the obstacles to the settlement. Some people even have suggested that 1/3 of the LRA can never be brought to the negotiating table simply because they know no other existence. Indeed, this is perhaps one of the most tragic dimensions of the conflict. They have no families to go home to. They have been warriors all their life. I'm talking about the child soldiers here. There have been some signs that with elections approaching, President Museveni has concluded that it is now in his interest that the UPDF be more systematic and professional and defeat the LRA. They would certainly gain some support in the north and especially the south, but it is also a fact that key members of the regime and the army, whose leadership is an integral part of the regime, have long profited from the war. The ghost soldiers issue, which was the subject of a commission of inquiry, shops run by middle-level commanders for enlisted troops, and especially procurement issues. Substantial amount of corruption associated with the war, and certainly a phenomena that has not provided an incentive to end the war in the past. Finally, the issue of corruption, which is partly financed, both directly and indirectly, by the donor community. Corruption continues. It is pervasive, and it involves prominent members of the first family, if not the president himself. His brother, Salim Saleh, former head of the Army, still head of the Army Reserve, architect of the Presidential Guard Brigade, has been involved in a number of questionable dealings, all of which have been documented thoroughly by the government of Uganda's own Commission of Inquiry, the Porter Commission of Inquiry, in respect to the illicit trafficking in gold from the Congo, and the Commission of Inquiry into the ghost soldiers dealing with the army in the north. His son, President Museveni's son, Muhoozi Kainerugaba, the de facto head of the Presidential Guard Brigade. Samuel Kutesa, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who was censured for conflict of interest by the Sixth Parliament, and who is a business partner with Salim Saleh, and whose daughter is married to Muhoozi. James Muhoozi, the Minister of Health, also censored by the Sixth Parliament. Amana Mbabazi, the Minister of Defense, whose wife was the Commissioner of the Uganda Revenue Authority, but was ultimately eased out of that position after alleged fiddles there in respect to customs, but who is now the Managing Director of Luwero Industries, a firm that produces